Hello everyone, I'm Eric Rain, and today I'm going to show you how to turn your Baldur's Gate 3 character into the most powerful Necromancer in all of Faerun, an immortal lich, a true master of the undead that would make even Balthazar jealous. A build so strong that you can easily clear honor mode with it. Okay, maybe the introduction was a little over the top, but stick around until the end of the video and I think you'll agree that this is one of the strongest builds in the entire game. The video is split into 3 parts. First, we'll go through the leveling process step by step. Then I'll show you all the gear that you'll need and explain where to get it. And finally, of course, we'll take a look at how this Necromancer actually plays in combat. So let's get right into it. So what exactly is the idea behind this setup? The beauty of this build is that it can fill almost every role in the party at once. With this build you are a tank, a damage dealer, and a support character all at the same time. And that's possible thanks to the massive army of summons under your control. They'll be dealing damage, soaking up hits, and overwhelming enemies through the sheer numbers, while your main character will heal, debuff targets, control the battlefield, and deal damage whenever necessary. Exactly what you'll be doing depends on the encounter, of course, and we'll go into much more detail once we get to the gameplay section. But let's start with leveling. The build is based on the wizard class, so that's what we're taking at level 1. For cantrips, pick a Toll the Dead for necrotic damage, Friends if this is your main character, and a mage hand. For your starting spells, grab Shield, Magic Missile, Chromatic Orb, and Find Familiar. If you're playing this build from level 1, I would also recommend taking Sleep and Ice Knife, because they can be extremely powerful spells in the beginning. For ability scores, go with 8 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 17 Constitution, 16 Intelligence, 12 Wisdom, and 9 Charisma. If you care about dialogue checks and this is your main character, then I would instead drop Dexterity to 10, reduce Wisdom to 11, and raise Charisma to 12. Everything else stays the same. Honestly though, after a few playthroughs, I have started caring less and less about dialogue checks. Like, I always used to recommend bumping a lot of ability points into Charisma to many people, but these days I don't think that it's nearly as important as people make it out to be. Because with a cleric in your party, you can easily pass like 70% of the dialogue checks, even with trash Charisma. Sorry about the rant, but I had to put it out there. Let's get back to the leveling. At level 2, take the School of Necromancy subclass. This immediately gives you access to Grim Harvest, a passive that restores HP whenever you kill an enemy with a spell. The amount healed is equal to twice the spell slot used, or 3 times the spell slot level if the spell belongs to the Necromancy school. So if you kill something using a 6th level Necromancy spell, you'll heal for a whopping 18 HP for free. Needless to say that the passive is incredibly useful for the build. For your new spells, pick up Ray of Sickness and Tasha's Hideous Laughter. At level 3, grab Hold Person and Blindness. At level 4, take Resilient Constitution. This brings our Constitution up to 18 and gives us proficiency in Constitution saving throws. As you may remember, concentration checks are Constitution saves, and this build relies on concentration spells quite a lot. We'll get into that in more detail later. For cantrips, pick Blade Ward, and for spells, take Darkness and Mirror Image. At level 5, pick Counterspell, because let's be honest, this spell is super powerful. And for the second spell, take Vampiric Touch. It's very nice to have, especially in the beginning of the game. We do not take Animate Dead yet, since we'll get it automatically at the next level. Along with it, we get 2 extremely important subclass passives. One increases the number of undead we can summon, while the other makes them significantly stronger. For spells, take Glyph of Warding and Fear. Glyph of Warding is one of the best all-purpose offensive spells in the game, while Fear is an incredibly powerful crowd control spell that affects a huge area. And by the way, keep in mind that enemies affected by Fear will drop their weapons, and if you pick them up, most of them will just skip their turns after, and you don't even have to spend additional action points on it. At level 7, take Blight and Conjure Minor Elemental. At level 8, take Polymorph and Fire Shield. and use your feat to raise intelligence to 18. At level 9, grab Conjure Elemental and Hold Monster. At level 10, we gain another passive feature that gives our character resistance to necrotic damage. For cantrips, take Poison Spray, and for spells, choose Dominate Person and Cloud Kill. At level 11, take Circle of Death and Create Undead. For the final level, we're multi-classing and taking one level of Nature Domain Cleric. The only reason we are doing this is to gain proficiency with heavy armor, since we don't have spare ability scores to dip into dexterity much, and without heavy armor we are going to be pretty squishy. For cantrips, you can take Guidance, Resistance, and Thaumaturgy, and make sure to select Thorn Whip from the additional cantrip menu. For spells, take Sanctuary and whatever second spell you prefer. Something like Command or a healing spell works perfectly fine. Now that we are finished with leveling, let's talk about items. So yeah, as I've mentioned several times already, the entire build revolves around crowd control and dealing massive damage through our summoned creatures. On top of that, thanks to the Necromancer's healing passive, access to heavy armor and shields, and a few healing options of our own, the build also has a surprisingly strong tanking potential, though we'll need a few key items for this build to actually be very strong. The single most important item for this build is, without question, the Necromancy of Thay. You can obtain it in Act 1 and it comes in two parts. The first is the book itself, which can be found in the cellar of one of the buildings in the Blighted Village. Just head downstairs as shown on the screen and pick up the tome from the locked room. The second part of the Necromancy of Thay is located nearby in the Whispering Depths, which can also be accessed through Blighted Village. The missing piece takes the form of a purple amethyst and can be found near the spider boss. The good news is that you don't actually have to kill the boss to get it. Once you have both parts, open the book and read it. Keep in mind that only one character can do this, so make sure it's the character who will become your party's Necromancer. Any curses you receive from reading the book you can remove with this spell. Later, once we reach Act 3, we'll need to visit Ramseth's Tower. From there, head downstairs and activate the Weave button on the left side as showed in the video. This will take you into the vault. Go through Silverhand door, then enter Evocation, followed by Wish. In that room you'll find a lever. Pull it while avoiding the traps, then return to the area near the Silverhand entrance and go through the newly opened Elminster's door. At the end of the room, behind a display case, you'll find the legendary Darkiate Codex. Read the codex and then reopen the Necromancy of Thay. It doesn't really matter if you pass the check. If you fail it, you'll just have to remove the curse. Reading Necromancy of Thay will reward you with the Danse Macabre. This is a unique spell that allows you to summon 4 ghouls out of thin air. Thanks to our Necromancer subclass feature, that number increases to 5. The ghouls are actually quite strong, although unfortunately you cannot directly control them. Now, I wouldn't say that the Danse Macabre is absolutely mandatory for the build. The uncontrolled ghouls can be a little annoying and skip turns for no reason at all, but without them your Necromancer will be noticeably weaker. After reading the Darkiate Codex, you'll also receive a curse. Once that curse is lifted, your character will get Darkiate Vigor, which grants 20 temporary hit points after every long rest. It's a nice buff to have, but it's not game-changing. The second incredibly powerful spell that we'll need is called Death Throne. You can find it in the same vault as follows. Go back through the Silverhand door, then enter the Abjuration, followed by Silver. Pull the lever and return to the main chamber. A new path leading to Karsa's room will now be open. At the end of the corridor, you'll find a scroll of Death Throne, which we simply learn with our wizard. As you can see, the spell is absurdly powerful. It deals massive damage, works from up to 30 meters away, and synergizes perfectly with our Necromancer healing passive. The only downside is that because of how strong it is, you can only cast it once per long rest. The final spell we'll need is called Eye Bite. Technically, we could have taken it naturally at level 11, but we skipped it due to limited spell choices. Fortunately, it's very easy to learn from a scroll. You can buy one in Sorcerer's Sundries or from any scroll vendor. Alternatively, you can buy Circle of Death scroll. In that case, you can take Eye Bite during leveling and learn Circle of Death from the scroll instead. Now that we have all three of those spells, let's finally talk about the gear we'll be using for this build. For convenience, I've divided everything into three categories: mandatory items, recommended items, and completely optional items. The single most important piece of the gear for this build is undoubtedly Staff of Cherished Necromancy. With this staff equipped, enemies will have disadvantage on saving throws against our necromancy spells. That means spells like Circle of Death, Blindness, Blight, Eye Bite, and Death Throne all will land almost every single time. As a result, these spells will become super reliable, which is very important, especially when you're trying to complete honor mode. That's why most of the time we'll be using necromancy spells during combat. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. We'll talk about gameplay a bit later. The staff's second passive ability is just as important as the first one. Whenever you kill a hostile creature, you gain the ability to cast your next spell without spending a spell slot. If used correctly, this effectively gives you an endless supply of spells of any level. So yeah, this staff is super powerful on Necromancer, and this build simply doesn't function at its full potential without it. Fortunately, obtaining it is fairly straightforward, and you can do that almost at the beginning of Act 3. Just kill the Mystic Carrion and pick up the staff from his dead body. The second item we'll want is the Circle of Bones. It grants resistance to all physical damage to our undead allies. This item isn't quite as essential as the staff, but it's still incredibly useful. You can loot it from Balthazar's corpse in Act 2. At that point, we've covered all the mandatory items. Everything else is optional, though still highly recommended. For the boot slot, I recommend using something that gives you more mobility, like Helldusk boots, Nightwalkers, which give you Misty Step, or any alternative. Spellcrook's Amulet is useful because it allows you to get one more level 6 spell slot, which is extremely helpful, and Crypt Lord Ring will allow you to spawn a high level summon without using a spell slot. What is really important is to get some good heavy armor and a shield. As you see, I'm currently using Ketheric's armor and Ketheric's shield, mostly for their defensive stats, meaning they can be easily replaced by almost any comparable piece of gear. As you can see, I'm also using Vivacious Cloak, Blackguard's Gauntlets, and After Death Do Us Part. But really, you can swap these items with any half-decent equipment that you have in your inventory. Finally, the most important step of all is to dye your armor sage green, so you actually look like a proper necromancer. Now that we've covered the gear, let's finally move on to gameplay. And we'll start with preparation, because preparation is extremely important for this build. The reason is simple. In order to create undead, we first need corpses, and lots of them. So how do we gather all of them in one place and make sure they never disappear? For that, we'll need two things: a character with high strength and the bull's strength buff. Ideally, the character should also be a human because of their increased carrying capacity. Every time you kill an enemy, simply pick up the corpse with the character and store it inside your camp chest. That way, you'll always have access to a supply of bodies that can later be turned into undead summons. However, there's one more important thing that you'll need to remember. You cannot resurrect corpses that were killed by necrotic, fire, acid, lightning, or radiant damage. Once the corpse is destroyed with those damage types, you cannot use it to create summons. Though remember that some other spells can also make a corpse useless for us. For example, force damage normally doesn't destroy corpses. However, disintegrate deals force damage, yet under certain conditions it will reduce the target to ash, leaving you with nothing to resurrect. So the point I'm trying to make is this: different abilities interact with corpses in different ways, and if you're playing a necromancer, it's important to understand those interactions. With that being said, don't obsess over preserving every single corpse, especially in honor mode. Taking unnecessary risks just to save a body isn't worth it. Simply try try to avoid destroying corpses whenever it's convenient. If your party is not made up entirely of spellcasters, you'll naturally end up with plenty of usable bodies anyway. Now let's say you've already collected a mountain of corpses. How do you prepare for a fight? First, we summon 4 flying ghouls through animate death. For that, we'll need 4 corpses. Flying ghouls are generally better than regular ones because they're much more mobile, while skeletons and zombies start falling off by Act 3 and are mostly useful during the first half of the game. Next, we use the Spellcrux Amulet to restore a 6th level spell slot and cast Create Undead, summoning a mummy. Alternatively, you can use Crypt Lord Ring for that. If you don't have the Spellcrux Amulet or the Crypt Lord Ring, you can simply summon the mummy later during or after combat using the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. Then we summon 5 ghouls using Danse Macabre. After that, summon an elemental using a 5th level spell slot. Theoretically, you can use a 6th level slot if you want, but again, that's usually only possible through the staff's passive or something similar. Finally, summon a minor elemental. I personally like Ice Mephitis. And there you have it. Here's your army. Sure, you can go further and learn, for example, Planar Ally or some other summon through scrolls if you want. Generally speaking, the more summons you have, the better. The only thing limiting us is the number of prepared spells. If, for example, you unprepare Conjure Elemental, your elemental immediately disappears. Once all of our summons are ready, we'll need a level 12 cleric with 8 and Hero's Feast to buff all of our summons. And yeah, that character doesn't even need to be in your active party. He can just sit in the camp and simply buff your army whenever necessary. Ideally, you would actually want 2 clerics. One uses their 6th level slot on Hero's Feast, while the other uses their 8, since 8 scales with spell level. As a result, most of your summons will be around 80 HP, which is huge considering their sheer number. Now let's move on to our Necromancer himself. First of all of our summoning spells obviously need to remain prepared. We've already covered that. Because our summons disappear if our Necromancer dies, survival becomes extremely important. That's why I highly recommend always preparing Shield and Counterspell. Shield keeps us alive, and Counterspell protects not only us, but also our allies and summons. If you see an enemy caster preparing something like a Fireball, while half of your army standing in one spot, don't be stingy with high-level counterspells. As I've already mentioned, we're not just a tank, we're also one of the main damage dealers in the party. Most of our damage comes from Death Throne and Blight. Remember, thanks to the staff, enemies have disadvantage on saving throws against these spells, making them extremely reliable. If an enemy survives with only a little health left, you can always finish them off with Magic Missile. A more situational but still extremely useful offensive spell is Cloud Kill. It's not the easiest spell to use if you are not playing solo, because it damages absolutely everyone inside the area. Though don't forget that your undead are actually immune to poison damage, so it will damage everyone but not them. By the way, if you really want to optimize this spell, you can even have your camp cleric cast protection from poison on party members who don't already have poison resistance. These 4 offensive spells are the ones I'd keep prepared at all times. The last category of spells in our arsenal is of course crowd control. The most important one by far is Eyebite. It's an incredibly powerful spell, but it works in a somewhat unintuitive way, so let's break it down. As you can see, Eyebite consumes a 6th level spell slot and allows you to inflict one of 3 conditions on a target: asleep, panicked, or sickened. Each option has its uses depending on the situation. But here's the interesting part. Once you apply one of those effects, your character begins concentrating on the spell. As long as the concentration remains active, you can continue applying additional Eyebite effects over and over again. And this is where things get really important. The effect you apply afterwards don't require their own concentration. In theory, with this spell, you can put every enemy on the battlefield to sleep. Even if your concentration gets broken, only the first target you affect affected will wake up. Everyone else will remain asleep. Also remember that you can use multiple eyebite effects on a single enemy, which can be useful if you, for example, are fighting a boss. Sorry if all that sounds a little confusing. Once you actually start using the spell, you'll immediately understand what I mean. Okay, listen guys, so while writing a script for the video, I noticed that after you cast the original eyebite spell on a target, the free eyebite spells are actually benefiting from my wisdom and not intelligence, whereas the original spell benefits from intelligence as it should be. After further investigation, I realized that for some reason the free eyebite spells are not tied to the wizard class main ability, but rather the main ability score of the class that you picked the last, which in this case was cleric, and that's why the free eyebite spells used wisdom. What it all means is that for this spell to work properly, once you reach level 12 you actually need to respect your character and pick the cleric class first and multi-class to wizard only after that. I hate to make this section even more confusing, but I guess what can you do? If you understood everything I said, please let me know in the comment section. I really need some closure. But that's all about that. Let's continue with the video. Don't forget that eyebite belongs to the Necromancy school, which means enemies will almost always fail their saving throws against it, thanks to our staff. It's also worth paying attention to the abilities of our summons, since many of them synergize extremely well with eyebite. For example, while target is asleep, your ghouls can use their devour ability to heal themselves, and if a target is frightened, your mummy can unleash an incredibly powerful multi-attack. So yeah, eyebite is very powerful. It can disable enemies in bulk, weaken entire groups, or simply remove them from the fight altogether by putting them to sleep. The second extremely useful debuff spell is blindness. By upcasting it with a 6th level slot, we can blind up to 5 enemies at once. Not only does this reduce their effectiveness in the battle, but attacks against blinded enemies are made with advantage, which helps compensate for the mediocre accuracy of our ghouls. The best part is that blindness doesn't require concentration. That means it works perfectly alongside eyebite instead of competing with it. And once again, blindness is a necromancy spell, meaning enemies will have disadvantage on their saving throws against it. As for the more questionable control spells, I'd put polymorph and dominate person into that category. They're not bad spells by any means, but unlike our necromancy spells, they don't benefit from the staff's saving throw penalty. On top of that, they require concentration, meaning every time you use them, you're giving up eyebite. By default, I don't think that's worth it. I'd only recommend using polymorph or dominate person if you're getting tired of eyebite and want a bit more variety in your playthrough. You'll definitely be weaker, but the fights might become a little more interesting. I would put fear in the similar category. It also requires concentration and isn't nearly as universally useful as eyebite. However, because it affects a large area, there are situations where it can actually outperform it. And as I showed earlier, simply forcing enemies to drop their weapons is already incredibly valuable, especially if multiple enemies are affected at once. That being said, don't forget that fear belongs to the illusion school rather than necromancy, so it won't be nearly as reliable. The one spell that genuinely outperforms eyebite in certain situations is Hold Monster. It's an insanely powerful spell, which you probably already know. The description alone tells you why. A paralyzed enemy not only loses their turn completely, but every attack against it becomes a critical hit. That said, you still need to use Hold Monster carefully. Without additional debuffs, enemies can often succeed on the saving throw, making it much less reliable than our necromancy options. So that's pretty much how our core spell selection works. As for the spells we haven't talked about yet, most of the first level spells we picked up early are only really useful during the first half of the game. By level 12, there's usually very little reason to cast them anymore. Just remember that we only have so many prepared spell slots available, so we cannot bring absolutely everything at once. So to summarize, these are the spells that I consider mandatory and would keep prepared at all times. Everything else depends on the situation. Here's the full setup I personally like to run, but obviously every encounter is different, and sometimes even the most niche spells can completely win a fight on its own. Oh, and speaking of spells, I completely forgot about our cleric spells. We won't be using them very often, but they're still worth mentioning. I highly recommend preparing Sanctuary because it allows you to protect not only your party members, but also your summons, saving you the trouble of having to resummon them later. For the second spell, I'd probably take a healing spell, mostly just to have another way to heal when other options are not available. Now, originally I wanted to go into detail about how to actually play this build during a combat, but at this point we've already covered most of the important spells individually, so I'll keep this section very brief. When a fight starts, I usually open by casting blindness on multiple enemies. That way my minions can attack them with advantage for the rest of the encounter. On the second turn, I generally try to use Eye Bite, assuming I still have a 6th level slot available. A lot of the time I won't because I've already spent it summoning minions beforehand. In those situations, I prefer using one of my damage spells to finish off an enemy and then immediately use the staff's passive ability to cast a 6th level spell for free. Usually it's Eye Bite. Of course, if another spell makes more sense in the situation, nothing is stopping you from using that instead. At that point, it mostly comes down to experience and game knowledge. Unfortunately, that's not something a single video can teach. As for consumables, don't neglect potions of speed. They're incredibly strong on this build, because as I said, if our concentration breaks after a few turns, it doesn't really matter. Various elixirs can also be useful. Elixir of Bloodlust in particular synergizes very well with everything else we're already doing. You can also use Elixir of Vigor to compensate low initiative. As for our summons, their gameplay is pretty straightforward. Just surround enemies and beat them to death. The main thing you want to avoid is sending every single summon after the same target, because that leaves you extremely vulnerable to enemy AoE spells. On the other hand, remember that your ghouls generally have a lot of health and are surprisingly difficult to kill. Also keep in mind that every ghoul attack has a chance to paralyze its target, meaning your undead can potentially output absolutely ridiculous amounts of damage. By the way, don't forget about ghouls' ability to heal themselves by devouring prone targets. That's especially important because undead cannot be healed through normal means. And actually, I discovered a funny little trick. You can create an ice surface, intentionally make one of your allies slip on it, and then have your ghouls devour that ally to heal themselves. Very roleplay friendly trick, I would say. So yeah, that's pretty much everything you need to know about playing this build. Once you understand the core idea behind it, you'll realize it's actually quite simple to use. Not because you'll always know the perfect move, but because the build itself is just absurdly powerful. When I was recording the gameplay footage for this video, I honestly wasn't even trying very hard. I just walked into a fight and started attacking things one by one, and I still didn't lose a single battle. And that's despite the fact that I was playing solo. So yeah, here's the build. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss future Baldur's Gate 3 builds and other videos I'm planning to make about this game. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.